Hey everyone, welcome back to theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Again, it's theclinicaltrialsguru.com. I have regular guest contributor, guru, if you will, Mr. Darshan Kulkarni. He's an attorney. He focuses very heavily on clinical trials and pharmaceutical law and legal matters. And anything we talk about is for your entertainment only and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. For that, you would need to actually call Darshan and perhaps pay him some real money, right?
Also, what we're going to discuss will also not be deemed to be medical advice because of the question we're going to address today.
Yes, and that's important because you are a pharmacist as well. And I keep forgetting to mention that. I mean, Darshan, go watch all the videos we have with Darshan. He's triple threat is what I call him.
Thank you.
And he's adding those threats every day. So Darshan, we're gonna talk about the recent Wellbutrin scandal.
Right.
It's been making waves, I guess, in the industry, and I've been out of town, so I missed it. I've been working on other projects. So can you kind of talk to us about that?
Sure. So the story with Wellbutrin is a drug that is primarily used for depression, and it was approved for depression, and it has several different formulations. It has several different strengths. So there's regular release Wellbutrin. There is, I believe it's SR is the twice a day version. Sorry, regular release is use it 3 times a day. SR is use it twice a day, and XL is use it once a day.
Ah,
So it's a line extension. And then obviously it comes in. I want to say, and I'm not looking at a website as I say this, but there's one. I think it's 75, 150, and 300 are the strengths that it's available in. The problem you have is that when you make a drug as a brand company, you will create the drug, you will test its release rate, and make sure that it works exactly as expected. The problem you have every so often is that when a generic tries to copy the brand name drug, they will often copy one version of it, say the 150 milligram, and then say, well, it worked for this one, so it should work just as well for the 300. What the FDA found out was that, so the situation in the Wellbutrin case was the one company basically, and I can't remember off the top of my head which company it was, but the company basically created generic Wellbutrin. The FDA approved it. It was 150 milligrams, and it seemed to work out just fine. The data seemed to suggest that it works out just fine. And then the FDA and they said we extrapolate that this data would also work for the 300. The FDA accepted that. That worked out great. Patient groups came out and said, we don't think that the 300 works exactly as expected. The FDA said, you're out of your mind. We think it does. We're fine. For 5 years, this process kept happening.
now this is for the generic.
Yeah, the generic.
Oh, okay.
So for 5 years, the FDA kept saying, we don't believe the patient groups who are telling us that generic 300 is not as good as brand 300 because we know that generic 150 is as good as brand 150.
Ah, okay.
At the end of the 5 years, the FDA said, fine. You know what? We'll do a study. We'll do a clinical trial and make sure that it is the same. They did the study, and it turns out it wasn't.
So they did a study on the generic 300.
Correct. The FDA did the study itself.
Really? So they were the sponsor.
We're the sponsor, which I think is unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, so they audited themselves.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So they did this, and they said, "Oh my God!" Turns out it's not. And there was as you can imagine, patients were upset. As you can imagine, sponsors were upset because it makes their brand drug look bad as well.
Yeah, because people say, okay, I'm taking generic Wellbutrin.
Right.
This must be the same thing as regular.
Exactly.
Now, they did clinical trials on the branded 300 Wellbutrin, right?
Well, on the branded 300 Wellbutrin, you would have to have done clinical trials at the time of approval.
So they
Because
did that and they demonstrated that it does work. That's why it was approved, right?
exactly,
Aha.
exactly.
Aha.
And in this case, now you have to remember that you could have 20 generics. And if you have 20 generics, each one typically does what's called bioequivalency. Do you know what bioequivalency is?
Yes. So it's very similar to what the branded molecule will do, but slightly different.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. So, and this is why I said we may want to say this is not medical advice.
Yeah, and
So
this is
the way
where your pharmacist
ex-
background comes in.
exactly. So the way it works is, I'm gonna start drawing in the air so that you can see what I'm doing. When you give someone drug, right? The amount of drug in your blood rises dramatically, and then it starts coming down like that, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, what you want to be able to say is that it takes for the brand and the generic typically. Now, again, there are exceptions to this, but typically you want to say it takes the same amount of time or approximately the same amount of time for the brand and the generic to reach what's referred to as maximum concentration.
Mm.
And then it stays in your blood for approximately the same amount of time that it actually works. So that's known as Cmax, Tmax, and AUC, area under the curve. So
So is
if you
that
draw,
where the receptors on the cells are all saturated?
not necessarily, it may
Ah,
not be a point of saturation. It may
okay.
just be a point of actually seeing that it works.
Oh, okay.
Cell saturation or receptor saturation may not necessarily be the point here.
Oh, okay.
Because your doses may be completely different. Because you could give much, much, much bigger doses and saturate the receptors,
Ah,
but you don't need that. You maybe just need a little bit to do that.
I
In
see.
fact, if you start saturating the receptors, you may start having significantly more adverse events. And this is really getting into a lecture I'm going to give in less than 2 weeks in one of my other classes that I teach. But it talks about the difference between minimum effective concentration and, well, minimum effective concentration, minimum toxic concentration, and you basically have to play between these two concentrations. If you go above the toxic concentration, you have more adverse effects than it's worth. You go below it, the drug just doesn't work. So you want your drug to basically be sticking your blood concentration to be between these two areas.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So what we saw in this situation was the drug, in the case of Wellbutrin, seemed to be going below the minimum effective concentration at the 300 mark,
Mm.
which was
Mm-hmm.
to be happening.
And
More
so in the
science.
generic, it was doing that. In the branded, it was not doing that.
Exactly, exactly. So, what is the impact of this on clinical trials, you would ask? Well, now the generic companies are going to have to do more clinical trials to prove that their different concentrations and formulations are bioequivalent.
Right.
And when you consider the fact that there are so many generic companies, each one with their own formulations, and you have to remember, generic company 1 will typically not have the same formulation as generic company 2.
Right.
And that's sort of how they get past the the patent lawsuits.
Mm-hmm. Now, are they not the same because there are infinite ways to make the compound, or they do that on purpose?
Well, two things. It's one, because there are an infinite number of ways to make the compound. So let's sort of take a step back. There are 4 ways to get a generic onto the market. Are we going off topic?
No.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
this is very interesting. Most of our audience are clinical people.
Okay. There are 4 ways to get a generic onto the market. One way is to say that there is no patent on the product. So I'm going to bring a generic, but there's no patent on the product itself. So for example, you might say morphine. Well, there's no patent on the product because morphine's existed since God knows how long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Option 2 is there is a patent on the product, but it expired.
Ah.
Option 3 is there is a patent on the product, but we won't bring the drug onto the market until the patent expires.
Right.
And then option 4, and this is the one that everyone seems to fight on. Option 4 is the one where they say there is a patent on the product, but the patent itself is invalid. And therefore we want to bring the drug onto the market sooner because the patent itself is invalid. Now, the advantage of doing what's called this paragraph 4, or patent itself is invalid, is that most brand companies don't ever want to be in a situation where their patent is invalid, because then the drug would be introduced into the market sooner and their period of exclusivity drops. The other advantage is that the first to file, the first generic company to say this patent is invalid and win, is referred to as a first to file and gets 6 months of exclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that they may not have a patent in the process, but no other generic company can come in and say, we want to sell the product as well at the same time.
Isn't that what Teva was doing? Isn't that pretty much what they do?
Everyone does this. Every generic company wants to get into this.
But they're like among the biggest ones, right?
Teva is the biggest, I believe Teva is the biggest generic pharma in the world.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that's going on. I'm trying to figure out where the connection was. I lost the connection there for a second.
Well, so the generics have to... historically, do generic companies do clinical trials? Do they conduct clinical trials?
Every single one of them does. But your definition of clinical trials is different. So in most clinical trials, you're thinking of placebo-controlled, double-blinded, multinational, multi-center studies that are random.
Yes.
In this case, you're talking about 12, 20-person studies. All you're trying to prove is fed and fasting equivalency. All you're trying to prove is this drug is the same as the other drug because we ran it in 20 people, and the blood concentrations are exactly what you would expect.
And how many participants do they typically enroll in these kind of studies?
Like 12 to 20 people.
Ah, that's it.
That's
so
it.
Usually one site,
Right.
probably very carefully selected by them.
Probably. And
Okay.
which is why when you do studies in India until 2005, this is what they all did. So when you see a site in India that says we did global clinical studies since 1995,
Yes.
first 10 years of their existence, they were probably doing a lot of generic equivalency type of studies.
Right.
And then in 2005, the TRIPS agreement kicked in, which is an international patenting process. And we can get into that if you want. Or this may be a whole new lecture we can get into, because it talks about pharmaceutical patenting and what's going on in India with compulsory licenses and all that good stuff.
Yeah, a lot going on over there.
Yeah, it's a nightmare for a lot of big pharma. But basically, since 2005, that's when the CRO, clinical trials industry, took off in India because product patents kicked in. So basically what happened was until 2005, the pharmaceutical industry had the following process in India. The Indian government said, you can, and I'm going to pick on a brand name, obviously that's not relevant here, but let's say we're talking about Protonix. The Indian government said, you cannot patent the formulation of Protonix. You can only patent a way of making Protonix. But what happened was that a brand name company would say, here is one way to make Protonix, and then the Indians were very, very good at coming up with 50 other ways of making that same Protonix.
Mm-hmm.
India is, I believe, the largest pharmaceutical manufacturer of drugs in the world.
It makes sense. They have so many scientists there just willing to work nonstop to do this.
Right, but more importantly, they're very good at copycat type of work.
Mm-hmm.
India's still struggling with things like biosimilars. And I recognize that there are people like Dr. Kiran Mazumdar who's doing very good work in the area of biosimilars and biologics themselves. But the fact is that at this moment, they're still struggling with it.
I see.
Because it's a totally different type of process. Innovation is very different from copying.
Right.
And that requires a totally different type of thought process. And the Indians are still trying to catch up there. But we're obviously getting off track. The point here was, in the case of Wellbutrin, you will see a lot more studies being done to show this bioequivalency, and you'll see a lot of Indian companies trying to do those studies because you'll see a lot of generics coming out of India. So
I see.
Wockhardt, Dr. Reddy's will all be doing these types of studies.
So for the clinical trial, this would mean that the FDA would now mandate, or is going to be very closely looking at mandating larger clinical trials for these generics?
I'm not sure they would be looking at doing larger clinical trials. They'd probably be looking at doing more clinical trials.
More, okay.
Say, I want to see it for every formulation that you have.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to seeing one and saying we can hypothesize that it applies to your other formulations.
Now, does that mean that if these generic manufacturers need to spend more on clinical trials, the price of these generics are going to go up?
Well, that's going to be one of the factors.
Mm-hmm.
As today, actually, they released the GDUFA. Do you know what GDUFA is?
I heard about it, yes.
the Generic Drug User Fee Act.
Yes.
Um, they released the cost of facility registrations, and it's astronomical. A
Uh huh.
lot of generic pharmaceutical companies are going to say, "I can't pay that." It's the cost of existing. Then you have to pay the cost of actually making products.
Yeah.
So a lot of generic manufacturers are going to say, "I can't afford that," and therefore I need to get out.
And if they're doing all that, they might as well start doing some innovation and make their own drugs. I mean, at that point, they become sponsors.
Well, the numbers change completely.
Ah.
So, and then this is a question actually I answered on Quora a couple of weeks ago, probably, on why don't more brand companies have generic followers, if you will, or
Mm.
generic companies underneath them. It's a completely different business model. So, for example, brand companies are very, very good at innovation, but innovation takes cost, takes time, and takes decades of sort of patience.
Yes.
Generic companies aren't typically like that. They're typically much smaller, much more efficient organizations, but that comes at a cost. They can't sort of spend money and time trying to pursue a product for very long, especially if
Right.
there's a high enough chance that it will fail.
Mm-hmm.
Generic companies don't. Also, the cost of making a drug for a brand company, for example, is much higher because they have layers of regulatory support, while brand companies don't have the same layer. Sorry, well, generic companies don't have the same layers. So the costs built into the brand model are completely different from the costs built into a generic model. So a generic company is unlikely, or if they do try, they will often build it to a certain level and then just sell it to a brand company to develop. And there are
Right.
companies that do that.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
So definitely something to keep an eye on. It's obviously developing. Right.
absolutely.
We'll report more on this. Anything else you'd like to add, Darshan?
Not on this topic. I have another idea that we can talk about later.
Oh, very good. Well, let me give my clinical trial guru producers a shout out. Sarah Elizabeth Siegler, Resolve Research Solutions, Accurate Clinical Trials, Erdhart Clinical Trials, PTNR, Patrick Stone, Mr. Darshan Kulkarni, Biopharm Systems, Zymewire, Mosio, South Coast Clinical Trials, Breakthrough Clinical Trials. Thank you all, and still accepting more producers, so email me, Dan at theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Thank you, Darshan, very much for providing your expertise. This is something interesting that we need to look at as our clinical trial landscape is changing.